Police!
Police!
Come out now! Step outside with your hands up!
My hands are visible. Show me the warrant before anyone moves.
We have a warrant. Step outside and we'll talk.
No, show the warrant, then we talk.
I'm not refusing lawful orders. I'm requesting legal authority before I step into your life.
Hold position.
A group of armed officers thought they could surround a house in the middle of the night, point rifles at a front door, and force the people inside to come out first and ask questions later. What they didn't know was that the calm man standing in that doorway, with his hands clearly visible, wasn't a scared resident they could intimidate into compliance. He was a deputy U.S. Marshal, trained to read danger, trained to stay disciplined, and trained to never surrender control of a situation that could get his family hurt. In the moment the officers decided to escalate without even putting a valid warrant in front of him, they unknowingly turned their own operation into evidence. At this moment, we want to tell you that we're genuinely grateful you chose to spend your time with us today. Drop where you're watching from, city or state, because these stories hit different depending on where you live. And if you care about accountability, body cams, home cameras, and people knowing their rights under pressure, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now zoom out and understand what made this night different. This wasn't a random homeowner arguing with police for the sake of it. This was a federal law enforcement professional who knew exactly how quickly step outside can turn into hands on your head, and then into something nobody can undo. He wasn't trying to win an argument. He was trying to keep the rules in place long enough for everyone to realize they were at the wrong house. It started with sound before anything else. Heavy vehicles stopping too close. Doors shutting hard. Radios. Then the lighting hit the front of the house like a stadium, washing the porch and windows in white glare. Multiple officers moved into position, and the family inside immediately understood this wasn't a single patrol car checking a noise complaint. This was a planned entry. Jordan Reed had been asleep hours earlier. He lived a routine life outside of work because that's what kept his family safe. Quiet street, predictable schedule. Cameras positioned to cover the driveway, porch, and side gate. Not for paranoia, but because he'd spent years seeing what happens when a story depends on someone else's version of events. That night, the cameras caught everything from the first second. The officers took over the front of the property and started issuing aggressive commands. They demanded that whoever was inside come out immediately. They announced they were there to execute a warrant. They spoke like the situation was already solved, and the only thing left was submission. Jordan didn't match their energy. He didn't shout back. He didn't step outside to prove anything. He moved into the doorway position that allowed him to keep his hands visible and his body controlled, with the threshold between him and the rifles still on his terms. He identified himself as law enforcement and demanded to see the warrant before any movement happened. That demand irritated the lead officer instantly. The officer treated the request like an obstacle, not a legal requirement. He kept pushing the same tactic. Get Jordan out of the house, get him into their space, get him into their control. Jordan didn't argue about feelings. He stuck to procedure. He repeated that no one was stepping out until the warrant was shown and confirmed. He kept his hands up where everyone could see them, because he understood what hands not visible can turn into when adrenaline is high and egos are involved. Alyssa Reed came up beside him fast. She wasn't panicked, but she was alert in the way you only get when you've lived around risk long enough to recognize it. She backed him up, told the officers the exterior cameras were recording, and made it clear that the family wasn't going to rely on anyone's memory of this night. That changed nothing at first. If anything, it hardened the posture outside. The lead officer leaned into the pressure tactics that departments use when they want control more than clarity. He framed Jordan's request for documentation as non-compliance. He implied the safest thing was for Jordan to do what they said first and handle paperwork later. Jordan didn't fall for it. He knew how that script ends for people who don't have leverage, training, or a badge. He also knew something else. If they really had the correct address and a valid warrant, showing it would take seconds. The longer they avoided it, the more likely the operation was flawed. Outside, officers shifted positions and tightened their perimeter, like they were trying to compress the situation into a quick surrender. Inside, Jordan and Alyssa held their line without making any sudden moves, without giving anyone an excuse to claim fear or confusion. And the standoff started to stretch. Minutes felt longer because every second included rifles, lights, and officers who were acting like questions were a threat. The officers outside kept trying to turn the situation into a simple choice. Step out and everything gets easier, or stay inside, and they'd treat it like a threat. That was the whole pressure strategy. They wanted Jordan Reed away from his doorway, away from his cameras, away from his wife, and standing under their lights where they could dictate every movement. Jordan didn't let them set that frame. He kept his hands visible and his body still. He repeated the same point in the same calm tone. No one was coming outside until the warrant was shown and the address was verified. He made it clear he wasn't refusing law enforcement. He was refusing a process where the officers demanded control first and proof later. That's when the lead officer started using language that departments lean on when they want to blur rights into attitude. He treated Jordan's request for documentation like it was a challenge to authority. He implied that insisting on seeing the warrant meant Jordan was making the situation unsafe. He pushed the idea that safety required Jordan to surrender the one advantage he still had, which was staying inside his own home. Alyssa stayed next to Jordan and kept reinforcing two things. The home was being recorded on multiple angles, and the warrant needed to be displayed on camera. She didn't do it emotionally. She did it like someone who understood that later, this would either be a clean timeline or a messy argument. The officers tried another tactic. They demanded Jordan prove who he was. Jordan told them he could show credentials, but he wasn't going to start moving around the house in a way that could be misread, and he wasn't stepping out to present anything without first seeing the warrant. That's the trap a lot of people get forced into in these moments. Officers demand proof, but create conditions where reaching for proof becomes suspicious movement. Jordan refused that trap too. At one point, the lead officer escalated his tone and started talking like he had the legal authority to override the doorway. He framed the situation like Jordan was delaying an operation and would be responsible for what happened next. That kind of language is designed to make people panic and comply. It's also designed to set up a later report that paints the homeowner as the problem. Jordan didn't take the bait. He requested a supervisor. He requested the watch commander. He asked for the warrant number and the issuing court information. He repeated that if they were at the wrong address, every second they spent pointing rifles at a family would become a serious liability. This was where the power chess game showed itself. The officers were playing for immediate control. Jordan was playing for verification and documentation. He understood something most people don't in the moment. Once you step outside, you lose the ability to slow it down. The lead officer then tried to isolate him. He directed Alyssa to move away from the door and stop recording. Alyssa didn't argue about it. She simply made it clear that recording was already happening and that the footage would be preserved. She stated more than once that they were documenting names, vehicles, and decisions. That mattered because it removed the fantasy that this would disappear into a report written later. Some of the officers held their rifles steady, locked into the posture they'd started with. One officer looked less comfortable, like he'd realized the moment was drifting out of control. That officer wasn't calling the shots, but his body language hinted at doubt. Then the lead officer made the slip that changed everything. He admitted, in the way officers sometimes do when they're frustrated, that the warrant could be dealt with after Jordan was outside and secured. He treated the paperwork as an inconvenience, not the foundation of the whole operation. That told Jordan exactly what kind of mindset he was dealing with. Domination first, documentation whenever it became necessary. Jordan responded by tightening his message, not raising his voice. He repeated that he was not stepping into a situation where he could be detained at gunpoint, without first seeing legal authority for the raid. He emphasized that he was a deputy U.S. Marshal and that a wrong house entry with rifles raised was the kind of error that destroyed careers and budgets. The lead officer didn't like that. He pushed harder, trying to reframe Jordan's calm boundary as defiance. He kept pressing the same demand to exit. He kept suggesting Jordan was obstructing. And that's when Jordan did something that forced the issue. He told them he was going to stay exactly where he was until they physically displayed the warrant on camera with the address clearly visible and until a supervisor confirmed the location. He made it clear that if they chose to escalate further without doing that, the footage would show who made that decision. That took the oxygen out of the threats. Because now it wasn't just a standoff. It was a recorded decision point. Either they produced the warrant and verified the address, or they doubled down on an operation they couldn't fully justify in real time. In the next moments, the radio traffic changed. You could hear it in the way the officers started communicating with each other more than they were communicating with the door. That's when you knew someone on that line was starting to wonder if they were standing at the wrong house. The moment Jordan Reed forced the conversation into one single requirement, the entire operation outside started to wobble. The officers could keep shouting commands, but they couldn't keep avoiding the one thing that justified them being there. And Jordan had made sure that avoidance was the center of the video. The lead officer finally signaled for someone to bring the warrant forward. The movement outside changed from raid posture to paperwork scramble. A few officers still held their rifles up, but now they were looking sideways at each other, like they were waiting for the document to settle the argument. Jordan didn't step closer. He didn't lean out. He kept his hands visible and his body positioned so nobody could claim he made a sudden move. He demanded they hold the warrant up in a way the cameras could capture, and he demanded the address be read and confirmed. Alyssa stayed right beside him, reinforcing that the cameras were already recording and that the warrant needed to be displayed clearly. She wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. She was making sure there was no later debate about what was shown and when. When the paper finally came into view, the energy shifted instantly. The address listed on the warrant did not match the Reed home. That single detail erased the entire posture the officers had been using. The aggressive tone stopped sounding confident and started sounding defensive. The command slowed down. The urgency drained. You could see it in how they moved, how they stopped advancing the moment they realized the document couldn't protect them anymore. Jordan pointed out the mismatch immediately, stayed controlled, and made it clear that they had surrounded the wrong house with rifles raised, while refusing to show the warrant when asked. He didn't treat it like a minor error. He treated it like what it was, a preventable verification failure that had placed his family in danger. The lead officer tried to recover the situation by reframing it as a simple mistake. He acted like it was time to disengage and move on. He wanted it to end right there, with no record beyond whatever report he wrote later. Jordan refused that outcome. He demanded badge numbers and names. He requested the supervisor again. He asked for the incident number and the unit identifiers. He made sure the camera angles captured as many faces and uniforms as possible. He also told them that because they had approached the wrong address, the full footage would be preserved and forwarded through formal channels. Alyssa backed that up by doing what a lot of people don't think to do in the moment. She started building the documentation while the officers were still standing there. She noted the time, the order of commands, and the fact they had pushed for Jordan to exit before presenting the warrant. She made it clear they were not relying on the department's version of events. The officers started retreating in small steps. Their rifles lowered more. Their stance opened up. The perimeter loosened. The same people who had demanded immediate compliance minutes earlier now wanted a quiet exit. Jordan didn't escalate. He didn't insult anyone. he stayed focused on accountability. He made it clear that the most dangerous part of the night wasn't the warrant itself. It was the decision to treat a home like a target before confirming the address, then trying to pull the occupant outside as a shortcut to control. That's the point a lot of viewers need to understand. Once an officer convinces someone to step out, the story becomes whatever happens on that lawn. Jordan was trained not to hand that power over. The lead officer attempted one last pressure move, implying that Jordan's insistence on documentation was creating problems. Jordan didn't accept that framing. He treated the problem as the raid, the wrong address, and the refusal to show the warrant promptly. The officers finally disengaged and moved off the property. The floodlights faded. The street went back to quiet, but the house did not. The Reeds didn't treat it like it was over, because they understood how these incidents get minimized once the vehicles leave. Inside, they immediately secured the footage. They saved copies from every camera angle, exported the clips with timestamps, and backed them up in more than one place. They wrote a timeline while it was fresh, minute by minute, including the first commands, the repeated demands to exit, and the moment the warrant was displayed. They recorded the names and badge numbers they were able to collect, and they wrote down vehicle descriptions and where officers had positioned themselves. Jordan also started making calls through proper channels. He notified leadership on the federal side, not as a flex, but as a safeguard. He understood that a local incident becomes a clean internal review only if the evidence is locked down before narratives get written. By morning, it wasn't just a scary night anymore. It was a documented case file. By sunrise, the officers were gone, but the Reeds didn't treat it like a scary story to laugh off. They treated it like an incident that could have turned fatal if Jordan had made one wrong move, or if an officer had decided to solve the problem with force. Jordan and Alyssa moved like investigators, not victims. They organized the footage into clips with clear labels: first contact, first command, first request for the warrant. Every time officers demanded Jordan exit, every time they implied his legal request was non-compliance, and the exact moment the warrant was shown with the wrong address. They saved the raw files, saved backup copies, and wrote a timeline that matched the camera timestamps minute by minute. Then they did something that usually changes whether accountability happens or not. They filed complaints immediately and in writing, and they attached the evidence. They requested the dispatch log and radio traffic. They requested the call for service record. They requested the warrant packet and who approved the entry plan. They requested the supervisor chain that night. They requested the Bodycam footage. They requested the names of every officer on scene and the justification for pointing rifles at a home before the address had even been confirmed. And when the city tried to reduce it to a wrong address mistake, the Reeds didn't let that framing stand. Because the core issue wasn't only that they were at the wrong house. The core issue is how long they stayed aggressive while refusing to show the warrant, and how hard they tried to pull Jordan outside so they could control the scene instead of verifying it. That's the part departments usually hope people forget. The internal review started with the usual defensive posture. The first wave of responses leaned on predictable language: confusion, fast-moving situation, officer safety, standard procedure. But the video didn't support the story they wanted to tell. The footage showed the opposite: a calm occupant with visible hands, repeatedly asking for basic documentation, while officers escalated and treated that request like defiance. Investigators pulled the timeline apart second by second. They saw the delay in producing the warrant. They saw the repeated attempts to lure Jordan out. They saw the aggressive commands continuing even after Jordan identified himself and made clear he was not resisting, only demanding the legal basis for the raid. They saw a crew that acted like paperwork was optional until it became inconvenient. And then the warrant itself did damage that no excuse could repair. It wasn't a close match. It wasn't a minor typo that could be argued. It listed a different address, which meant the officers had time to verify and didn't. They chose speed and intimidation instead. The city also ran into another problem. Jordan wasn't someone they could quietly dismiss or overwhelm with process. He understood how reports get shaped. He understood how timelines get blurred. And he understood how accountability only happens when evidence is controlled by the person who lived it. Alyssa was just as relentless. She tracked every contact with the department. She documented every response delay. She made sure every request was in writing. When the city tried to slow walk, she pushed harder. The strategy was simple. Keep it formal, keep it factual, keep it undeniable. As the review continued, the story started moving beyond the department. It spread because the facts were clean. Wrong house, rifles raised, warrant withheld until forced, pressure tactics to get the homeowner outside, cameras recording the entire escalation. And the homeowner wasn't even just a homeowner. He was a deputy U.S. Marshal, meaning if this could happen to a federal law enforcement family with cameras and training, it could happen to anyone. That public pressure mattered. Because once people see a clear video, the city can't hide behind vague explanations. Every attempt to minimize it makes it worse. The investigators concluded the officer's conduct was unjustified at key points, especially the escalation at the wrong address and the failure to promptly present the warrant when demanded. The department was forced to address what the footage showed instead of what they wished had happened. The lead officer took the hardest hit. The review pinned leadership failures on him, and the city moved to terminate him. The firing wasn't framed as a learning moment. It was framed as a consequence. Then came the civil side. The Reed's legal team didn't need drama. They needed clarity. They built the case around a simple sequence. Warrant required, warrant withheld, wrong address, intimidation, first tactics, recorded proof. They highlighted the risk created by ordering a man to step outside at gunpoint without verification, and the danger that put on a family who had done nothing wrong. The city saw the same thing. They saw a jury watching that video. They saw the timeline. They saw the wrong address on the warrant. And they saw that arguing officer safety wouldn't erase decisions that the footage captured in real time. That's how the settlement happened. The city ultimately agreed to a $5 million settlement, not because it wanted to be generous, but because the evidence made the risk obvious. The payment was the city admitting, in the only language cities reliably admit things, that this was not acceptable. And the ripple effects mattered. Policy changes followed. Verification procedures tightened. Supervisors became more directly responsible for confirming addresses. Departments started pushing clearer standards about warrant presentation and de-escalation when an occupant is calm and demanding legal documentation. The public conversation shifted too, because this incident showed something simple. We have a warrant means nothing if the warrant isn't shown and the address isn't verified. In the end, the Reeds didn't win because they screamed louder than the officers. They won because they stayed disciplined, kept their hands visible, refused to surrender control, and turned the entire night into a documented record that couldn't be rewritten later. And here's the question for you watching. If armed officers showed up at your door in the middle of the night, demanding you step outside, would you know what to ask for? And would you stay calm enough to protect yourself? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you've ever experienced something like this or seen it happen in your community, share what you learned. And make sure you like the video and subscribe because we tell the stories that remind people one hard truth. Rights only matter if you can hold on to them under pressure.
Stop right there. Identification.
What's the basis for stopping me?
ID. Now.
I can be verified through official channels right now. Call your supervisor desk and confirm.
No. You can show me your papers or you're coming with us.
I'm not performing on a sidewalk. Verify me the proper way. One call ends this.
An ICE team leader thought he could turn an anonymous tip into a quick street grab, treat a black man like a target and call it routine enforcement. He thought he could skip real verification, ignore basic procedure, and still walk away clean. What he did not know was that the man he was trying to detain, dressed in plain clothes and walking like any other pedestrian, was not a random person at all. He was Special Agent Darius Coleman, an undercover FBI agent on an authorized mission, and this stop was about to become the kind of recorded mistake that follows people into courtrooms. At this moment, I want to tell you something real quick. We're genuinely grateful you chose to spend your time with us today. Your support is what keeps this channel going and lets us keep telling stories where accountability actually shows up. Now, tell us where you're watching from in the comments, your city or your state. And if you like stories where power gets checked by facts, oversight, and receipts, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. So here's what was happening in that moment. On a busy sidewalk, Cole Harkins and his ICE team had Darius boxed in near the curb. Harkins was treating the situation like it was already decided. He had his agents positioned to cut off movement, hands hovering like they were expecting a fight, even though Darius was standing still and controlled. Multiple body cameras were running, not just on Harkins, but on Evan Price, Leah Park, and Grant Hollis, too. 4 angles, 4 microphones, and a timeline that would not be kind to anyone who tried to rewrite it later. Darius did not argue emotionally. He did not raise his voice. He did what trained federal agents do when someone comes at them with authority and no grounds. He tried to move the encounter into verifiable channels. He identified himself in a way that could be confirmed and pushed for the one step that would have ended the whole thing in under 2 minutes. A supervisor call and an official confirmation through the right desk. Harkins refused. Not because he could not verify, because he did not want to. And that refusal was the moment the stop stopped being about enforcement and became about ego. Darius was in plain clothes for a reason. He was working an authorized operation that required him to look ordinary, move normally, and not pull attention. In that world, flashing credentials on a sidewalk was not always an option. It could burn an operation, endanger people, or put the wrong eyes in the wrong location. So Darius tried to do it the professional way. He gave them enough to check him without forcing a scene. Harkins took that professionalism and treated it like disrespect. Grant Hollis shifted closer, ready to put hands on. Evan Price looked like he was waiting for an order he did not want to hear. Leah Park, the newest of the 4, had the posture of someone noticing the gaps. She was watching what Harkins was doing, not just what he was saying. Her body camera caught details the others did not, including how early Darius offered verification and how quickly Harkins shut it down. And while all of that was happening, people nearby were noticing. Not in a dramatic way, in a modern way. Heads turning, phones coming out. That quiet public attention that changes how a situation feels, because everyone knows what cameras can do now. This was not a traffic stop. This was not a controlled perimeter. This was a public sidewalk, and every decision Harkins made was being recorded from angles he did not control. Now, rewind a few hours. The whole thing started with an anonymous tip that came in like so many tips do. Not detailed, not confirmed, just specific enough to create a target and vague enough to cover mistakes. It described a person, a general area, and a claim about immigration status. No documentation, no clear evidence, no verified identity. Just an accusation floating in a system that can turn accusation into action if the wrong person treats it like permission. Harkins treated it like permission. He was the kind of agent who liked quick results. He liked being seen as decisive. He liked the feeling of control that comes from approaching someone who has no warning. And he had a team with him that day that made it easy to move fast. Hollis brought physical presence. Price followed structure. Park tried to do things the right way but did not have the seniority to overrule the lead. They geared up, cameras on, and drove out like it was a simple pickup. Here's the thing about stops like this when they are done lawfully. Verification is not optional. You do not just look at someone and decide their status. You do not treat an anonymous tip like it is proof. You build grounds, you document, and you confirm identity through the channels designed for that exact purpose. Harkins did the opposite. He went straight for dominance. Darius was walking toward a meet point tied to his assignment. Nothing about his behavior was chaotic. He was not hiding. He was not running. He was not doing anything that matched a threat narrative. He looked like a working professional moving through a city like thousands of people do every day. The ICE vehicles slowed. The agents stepped out. Harkins approached first, setting the tone. He demanded identification and started framing the situation like Darius had to prove he belonged there. Darius did not comply with panic. He complied with discipline. He asked what the legal basis was. He provided a controlled response. He made it clear this could be resolved quickly through official verification. What mattered next was not what Darius did. It was what Harkins refused to do. Harkins did not contact a supervisor. He did not use official channels to confirm identity. He did not treat the situation like a question that needed answering. He treated it like a test of authority, and he was determined to win it. Park, on her body camera, was the one who signaled the problem without making a scene. She pushed for verification steps that would cover them. She was trying to keep the stop inside policy. Price hovered in the middle, uncomfortable but still moving with the team. Hollis got impatient and started positioning for restraints. Darius remained calm, but he tightened his boundaries. He did not consent to a detention without grounds. He repeated the verification route. He tried to keep the operation protected while still giving them a clean way out. And that was when Harkins escalated the encounter into a detention anyway. Not because of new evidence. Not because Darius did something threatening. Not because the tip became reliable. But because Harkins decided that a black man in plain clothes, refusing to submit without verification, was enough for him to force the issue. And right there on that sidewalk with 4 body cameras recording every word and every choice, Harkins gave the order to take Darius in. Once Harkins gave the order to take Darius in, the whole stop shifted from a public contact to a forced detention. And that mattered for one reason. Now every step needed lawful grounds and clean documentation. And from that point on, the cameras showed the opposite. Grant Hollis moved first. He closed distance, controlled Darius's arms, and put him in restraints like this was already confirmed. Evan Price stood close and followed the physical positioning, but his body language looked like someone waiting for the missing piece that never came. Leah Park stayed slightly off to the side, watching the steps, watching the logic, and her body camera captured the most important thing of all. Darius kept offering a verification path, and the team kept choosing not to take it. Darius did not fight. He did not run. He did not give them anything they could later label as resisting. He stayed compliant with safety instructions, while still making it clear the detention itself was not justified. He told them repeatedly that he could be verified immediately through official channels. He gave them the kind of details that only needed one phone call to confirm, and he pushed them toward a supervisor call instead of a sidewalk power play. Harkins did what a lot of people do when they feel their authority being questioned on camera. He started reframing. He leaned on vague language about safety and uncertainty. He treated Darius's calm insistence on verification as attitude. He also started acting like Darius's identity claim was automatically a lie, even though he had not done the basic work to check it. This is where the power chess part showed up clearly. Harkins knew that if he called it in and it came back wrong, the stop would end right there, and his team would have to explain why they treated a random pedestrian like a confirmed target. So instead, he tried to win the moment first. Move Darius off the street, isolate him, and make the verification happen later, on Harkins's timeline, when the pressure could do the work. Park did not openly challenge him in front of the public, but she kept pushing procedure. She flagged the need to confirm identity before taking someone deeper into custody. Her camera caught her tone shifting from routine to concerned because she could see what was happening. They had no solid grounds, and they were recording that fact in real time. As they moved Darius to the vehicle, Bystanders kept watching. Phones were up. Nothing dramatic, just that modern, people know what this looks like energy. And that public setting mattered because it made it harder for Harkins to pretend the encounter was quiet and controlled later. Multiple cameras were running inside and outside the team. Once Darius was in the car, the team started doing what agencies often do in messy stops. They tightened control and limited options. They asked for identification again. Darius stayed consistent. He explained that he was on an authorized mission and could not start flashing sensitive credentials in public like a performance, but he could be verified immediately through the right desk. He asked for a supervisor. He asked for an official call. He asked them to confirm him the same way agencies confirm each other every day. Harkins still refused. And here came the mask-off moment, the one that later hit hard in court. Harkins started talking like the stop was justified because Darius fit what they were looking for. Not because of evidence, not because of a confirmed status, but because the anonymous tip described a look and a location, and Harkins decided that was enough. He treated Darius as probably undocumented, as if probably was a legal standard. He spoke like verification was a favor he did not owe. Park's angle caught the quiet pause after that, the kind where everyone on the team knows a line was crossed, but nobody says it out loud. This was no longer just a bad stop. It was a decision to treat appearance as probable cause. When they arrived at the field office, the same pattern continued. Instead of verifying first and correcting the mistake immediately, they went into processing mode, inventory, questions, forms. The usual machinery that makes a detention feel official even when it started wrong. Darius kept his composure. He did not threaten. He did not brag. He did not try to big league them. He stayed on one point. Verify him through official channels right now and end this. Harkins kept delaying. It took outside pressure to force the verification that should have happened on the sidewalk. That pressure came in the form of basic institutional self-preservation. Someone higher up started asking the obvious questions. Someone noticed the claim of a federal agent. Someone realized that if this went sideways, the cameras would make it impossible to bury. Park played a quiet role here. She did not go rogue, but she documented. Her footage captured the internal uncertainty and the repeated chances Harkins had to do the right thing. Price's footage captured the follow-the-leader dynamics. Hollis's footage captured how quickly physical control was applied without new justification. Harkins's footage captured the tone from the top, a team lead acting like he did not need to confirm what he was claiming. Eventually, a supervisor got involved, and the call was finally made. Not because Harkins wanted clarity, but because the situation had reached the point where refusing to verify looked worse than admitting a mistake. One official contact later, the truth landed hard and fast. Darius Coleman was confirmed as an FBI special agent. He was on an authorized mission. The details lined up. The identity was real. The verification was clean. And the entire detention had been preventable. The shift in the room was immediate. The tone changed. The routine enforcement posture evaporated. People started moving differently, speaking differently, trying to reset the situation like it could be rolled back. But that is not how recordings work. Darius was released. He was not loud about it. He did not celebrate. He handled it the way someone does when they know the real fight is not happening in that office. It is happening later, in a courtroom, in depositions, and in policy review. Before he left, he made one final point to Harkins, not as a threat, but as a fact. This situation happened because Harkins chose assumptions over verification, and every camera captured that choice. And here's what mattered most. Darius did not need the system to believe him. He only needed the footage to show what happened. In the days that followed, the quiet scramble started. Internal emails moved around. Conversations happened behind closed doors. The team had to write reports that matched what the cameras showed, and that is a hard thing to do when the cameras show you refusing to do the basic check that would have protected everyone. Darius did not let it fade. He filed the civil rights complaint. He preserved evidence. He retained counsel. And he requested the body camera footage early because he already knew what most people learned too late. The first fight is always over the record. Once Darius got out, he did not treat it like a bad day that he should swallow and move on. He treated it like what it was. A federal team used an anonymous tip as an excuse, skipped verification, detained him anyway, and recorded themselves doing it from 4 angles. And he understood something Harkins clearly did not. In a civil rights case, feelings do not matter as much as the record, and the record was brutal. Darius filed a federal civil rights lawsuit. The claim was simple and specific. The detention was not based on lawful grounds. It was based on appearance-driven assumptions, and the agents refused meaningful verification when it was offered repeatedly. He also alleged that the escalation was not about safety, but about control. The government's defense tried to build the usual wall. They leaned on the anonymous tip. They leaned on uncertainty. They leaned on the idea that Darius's identity could not be trusted in the moment. They tried to make it sound like the agents made a reasonable judgment under pressure. But the footage did not support that story. In discovery, the plaintiff's attorney did not rely on speeches. They relied on timestamps. They matched each agent's body cam audio to the others and built a clean timeline that showed what happened minute by minute. It did not matter if one camera missed a phrase, another camera caught it. It did not matter if one agent claimed they did not hear a verification offer. Another microphone picked it up. 4 angles made it hard to hide. Then came depositions. Harkins tried to justify his calls with careful language. He claimed he was acting reasonably. He implied Darius was uncooperative. He suggested the situation was unclear. But depositions are where stories get pinned down, and the video is where stories get destroyed. Every time Harkins described the stop as standard, the attorney pulled up the exact moment he refused the easiest verification step. Every time he suggested he had grounds, the attorney paused the footage and asked him to identify the grounds on the record. Every time he implied safety concerns, the attorney pointed to Darius staying controlled and compliant, while still asserting a right to verification. Price's deposition showed the follower problem. He could not fully defend what happened, but he also did not want to say he disagreed in the moment. That tension came through. Park's deposition was different. She did not grandstand. She explained procedure, explained what was missing, and explained why verification was the responsible move. Hollis tried to frame the cuffs as routine, but the footage showed how fast physical control came without the normal steps, and then the case went to trial. In the courtroom, the footage became the center of everything. Not one clip, not a highlight reel. The full sequence. The approach, the refusal to verify. The escalation, the detention, the delayed confirmation, the moment the truth finally landed, and the quiet shift in tone afterward. Jurors do not need to be legal experts to understand a simple fact. If someone offers a direct, official way to confirm who they are, and you refuse to take it, you are choosing ignorance. And when that choice leads to a detention, that choice has consequences. The defense tried to redirect blame onto the tip. They tried to frame the agents as acting in good faith. They tried to argue that Darius should have done more to prove himself. But that argument collapsed for one reason. Darius did exactly what he was supposed to do. He offered verification through official channels. Harkins rejected it. When the jury deliberated, it did not take long. The record was too clear. The verdict came back unanimous for Darius, and the judgment was massive, $15 million. That number was not about a payday. It was a statement about what the jury believed happened and how serious it was. It covered damages, the scale of the violation, and the fact that this was recorded misconduct, not a misunderstanding. After the verdict, the consequences moved fast. Cole Harkins did not get to quietly lead another team like nothing happened. The agency had to respond because the case was public. The footage was public in court, and the reasoning was on the record. He faced termination-level discipline, and his career in that role was done. The team's outcomes varied. Hollis faced consequences tied to how quickly he moved to physical detention without the verification step. Price faced consequences tied to following an unlawful escalation instead of pushing procedure. Park was treated differently because her conduct and her documented push for verification showed she recognized the problem. That did not erase the harm, but it mattered in how responsibility was assigned. Then came the bigger piece: policy changes. The agency implemented reforms that were directly connected to what the case exposed. Stronger verification requirements before detaining someone based on tips alone. Mandatory supervisor oversight for stops built on vague or anonymous information. Cross-agency identity confirmation procedures that had to be attempted when someone claimed federal affiliation and offered official verification. Long-term body camera retention so footage could not expire before legal review. Those changes did not fix everything, but they created friction in the exact place where Harkins had exploited speed and assumption. For Darius, the outcome was complicated. He got accountability. He got a verdict. He got policy change. But he also had to carry the reality of what happened. He was a federal agent on an authorized mission, behaving calmly, and it still did not protect him from being treated like a problem based on appearance. That is why this story stuck. Because it was not about one bad call. It was about how quickly a system can decide who deserves verification and who deserves detention. And if you're watching this, ask yourself something honestly. If Darius had not been FBI, if he had been a regular guy with a regular job, would anyone have ever made that verification call at all? Or would he have been processed, ignored, and labeled like so many people are? That's the lesson here. The difference was not dignity. The difference was documentation. So drop a comment. What would you have done in Darius's position, knowing you have to stay calm, but also protect yourself? And have you ever seen someone in authority skip steps because they thought they could? If you want more stories where power meets receipts and accountability actually lands, make sure you like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to the channel.
Man, let me see your ID.
What's the reason you need it?
ID, now.
What do you need?
Where are you coming from? What are you doing in this park? You got anything on you?
I'm not answering personal questions without a reason on record. What crime are you investigating?
Just cooperating. This is over.
Cooperate with...
A patrol officer thought he could walk up to a black man in a crowded city park, order him off a bench, demand identification, and hold him there with no reason on record. What he did not know was that the calm man sitting with his hands visible was not just another lunch hour visitor. He was someone trained to stay controlled under pressure, and someone whose work required him to understand exactly how far a badge could legally go. At this moment, we want to tell you that we are incredibly grateful you chose to spend your time with us today. Your support keeps this channel alive and thriving. Now tell us where you're watching from, your city or state, in the comments. And if you like stories where people stay calm, hold their ground, and let the facts do the damage, hit like and subscribe so you do not miss the next one. This happened during a busy lunch hour at Harborview Park, the kind of public space where office workers ate at food trucks, runners cut through on paved paths, and tourists stopped for pictures near the water. The crowd was the point. It meant eyes, phones, body cams, and witnesses who did not owe anyone loyalty. The man on the bench was Michael Reynolds. He looked like a regular guy taking a break. Casual clothes, nothing that stood out, no loud movements, no confrontation. What nobody in the park could see was that Reynolds was operating undercover on an active FBI assignment, and he was exactly where he was supposed to be. His presence was lawful and intentional. The officer who approached him was Daniel Hart. Hart had the posture of someone used to instant compliance. He did not walk up like he was checking on a lost kid or responding to a call. He walked up like he had already decided how this interaction was going to end. Hart stopped directly in Reynolds' space and ordered him to stand up and produce identification. He did not explain why. He did not reference a complaint. He did not mention a dispatch call. He gave commands. Reynolds did not match the energy. He stayed seated. He kept both hands visible where anyone could see them. He did not argue about feelings or accuse Hart of anything in that moment. He did what trained people do when they want a clean record. He asked for the legal basis of the stop. Hart gave none. Instead, Hart repeated the demands for identification, like volume could replace justification. He added personal questions next, trying to pull information without stating a reason for asking. Where Reynolds was coming from, what he was doing there, how long he planned to stay, whether he had anything on him he was not supposed to have. Reynolds stayed calm and kept the interaction narrow. He did not volunteer background. He did not start explaining his life. He asked again for the legal basis. At that point, Hart shifted from commands to control language. He told Reynolds he was being detained. Still no stated reason. Still no statute. Still no articulated suspicion that could be written down and defended later. This was the moment the power chess game became obvious. Hart was testing whether Reynolds would fold just because a uniform demanded it. Reynolds was testing whether Hart would put a real legal claim on the record. Because once a reason is stated, it can be checked. It can be compared to policy. It can be challenged. Hart did not want a reason on the record. Reynolds asked the kind of questions that forced clarity without raising the temperature. Whether he was free to leave, whether there was a specific crime being investigated, whether Hart had reasonable suspicion. He asked it with the same steady tone, because steady tone matters. It keeps the story about process, not attitude. Hart did not answer cleanly. He kept circling back to ID. Around them, the park did what parks do. People watched without wanting trouble. Then people started noticing the pattern. A uniform standing over a black man who was seated and calm. Repeated demands. No explanation. That draws attention fast. A teenager on a bench angled a phone toward the interaction. A food truck worker looked up and paused mid-task. A jogger slowed down on the path. A woman with a stroller stopped and stared long enough to confirm what she was seeing. Hart noticed the phones, and that changed him. His voice did not get quieter. His posture got tighter. He started talking like he wanted to end the conversation before it became a documented problem. The pressure tactics shifted. Less fishing, more force. More reminders that he had authority. More insistence that Reynolds comply now and ask questions later. Reynolds did not take the bait. He did not stand. He did not reach into pockets without warning. He kept his hands visible and his movements minimal. That detail matters because it removed every excuse Hart could later use to justify escalation. Hart tried a different angle. He implied Reynolds' presence was suspicious without naming what made it suspicious. He hinted at park issues and vague complaints without referencing any actual call. He suggested Reynolds should just cooperate if he had nothing to hide. This is where the mask started slipping. Hart made it about belonging. Not loudly, not with slurs, with that familiar tone that frames a black person as an interruption in a public space. The kind of wording that signals the real motive without ever admitting it. The moment sounded like a warning dressed up as routine policing, and the crowd heard it. So did Reynolds. Reynolds' job was not to win arguments with local officers. His job was to complete an assignment without exposing it. But there is a line where an unlawful detention becomes a direct threat to the mission. Time matters. Movement matters. If Hart decided to take Reynolds to a station, the assignment could get compromised. If Reynolds disappeared from his position, someone else in the operation could be put at risk. Reynolds stayed in control, but his calculation changed. He had given Hart multiple chances to articulate a lawful reason. Hart had refused every time. That meant this was not about public safety. This was about control. Now, Reynolds had to choose between protecting the assignment by staying undercover or stopping an unlawful detention by revealing just enough authority to end it. He chose the option that preserved the mission and created a record. Reynolds told Hart he needed to confirm something and that he was going to reach slowly. He kept his movements deliberate. He reached toward the one item that could end the entire performance in seconds. and he did it in a way that no reasonable person could frame as threatening. Hart watched his hands. The bystanders kept recording. And right before Reynolds revealed who he actually was, Hart made one more attempt to force compliance without justification, like he could still win this by sheer insistence. That was the last move Hart made before the board flipped. Reynolds stayed seated and kept the pace slow because he understood something Hart did not seem to care about. Every extra second of an unjustified detention in public, on camera, made the aftermath worse for the department. Reynolds made one controlled movement, then identified himself as a federal agent and confirmed he was on an authorized assignment. The change in Officer Hart was immediate. His posture loosened, his voice softened, the hard edge disappeared. He stopped talking like he was in charge of a suspect and started talking like he was dealing with an inconvenient mistake. He framed it as confusion. He implied it was routine. He tried to walk the interaction backward without leaving a clear reason on camera for why he started it in the first place. That flip told everyone watching exactly what this had been about. Hart had been comfortable applying pressure when he believed Reynolds had no power to push back. The second Reynolds revealed authority that could reach beyond the local department, Hart wanted out. Hart ended the detention fast. No citation, no warning, no investigation, no documentation offered. Just a sudden release in an attempt to make the whole thing disappear. Reynolds did not get pulled into a victory lap. He did not argue. He did not demand an apology in the park. He kept it procedural. He confirmed he was being released, confirmed there was no allegation, and then he disengaged cleanly. He did it like someone who knew this was not going to be handled in the grass and noise of a lunch crowd. It was going to be handled in offices, with footage, logs, and policy. Then he went back to his assignment. The bystanders did what people do now. They kept their recordings. A couple of them exchanged contact info. The teenager who had been filming did not chase Hart. He just kept the camera steady long enough to capture the moment Hart's tone changed, and the detention ended with nothing to justify it. Reynolds did not need a crowd to chant for him. He needed a clean record. He had it. Within days, the recordings moved where they were supposed to move. Internal Affairs received multiple submissions. Some came from civilians. Some came from within the department, because body camera footage exists for a reason even when people wish it did not. Internal Affairs started with the simplest question. If Hart claimed this was prompted by something, where was the trigger? They checked dispatch. No call, no complaint, no request for officer response, no radio traffic consistent with the reported issue in that area at that time. Then they checked the report system. There was no stop report, no field interview card, no documented detention, no narrative explaining reasonable suspicion. Nothing that would justify why a man on a bench was ordered to stand and produce ID and told he was detained. That absence was the problem, because the cameras showed Hart making the stop. The cameras showed Hart escalating. The cameras showed him using detention language, and the department had nothing on paper to match it. Internal Affairs did what good investigators do next. They went beyond the single incident. They pulled Hart's activity history and started looking for a pattern that matched what they just saw. Stops that began aggressively, stayed vague, and ended abruptly without documentation. They found it. Over and over, Hart was recorded initiating stop and release encounters in public spaces. Parks, sidewalks, transit areas. Places where presence could be framed as suspicion if nobody demanded a reason. The common thread was not arrests, it was control. Hart would approach, demand compliance, and then disengage once the person pressed for legal justification or once a phone appeared. The moment recording was obvious, his tone would shift, and the stop would end without a report. And another thread showed up as well. The people most often targeted in these vague stops were black. Internal Affairs expanded the inquiry into a formal misconduct investigation. That meant prior complaints that had been closed as unfounded or no evidence got reopened. Not because anyone suddenly cared about old paperwork, but because now there was a reference incident with video, timestamps, and a clear lack of lawful basis. When you have a clear anchor case, the past starts making sense. Supervisors were interviewed. Hart's Bodycam audits were reviewed. The department's own policies were compared to Hart's behavior. The investigators did not need to guess intent. They focused on what could be proven: repeated failures to articulate reasonable suspicion, repeated detentions without documented cause, repeated pattern stops ending once oversight appeared. Hart was placed on administrative leave. Inside the department, the conversation changed. Not publicly, not with press conferences, but internally where careers and policy live. Some people called it a misunderstanding at first because that word is useful. It makes problems sound accidental. It makes accountability feel optional. Internal Affairs did not treat it like a misunderstanding. They treated it like a repeated practice that finally collided with a case too clean to brush away. And this time, the person on the bench was not just a civilian with no access to institutional pressure. He was a federal agent who could confirm, without drama, that the stop was unlawful from the start and that there was no excuse available after the fact. That fact did not make Reynolds special. It just made the incident impossible to bury. Internal Affairs did not treat Hart's stop in Harborview Park as a single bad moment. They treated it as a test case that exposed a repeat behavior. They built the investigation the way it holds up later: timeline first, evidence second, policy comparison third, pattern last. They locked down the Harborview Park timeline from every angle: Bodycam, any nearby city cameras, witness submissions. They matched it to dispatch logs and confirmed there was no call for service tied to Reynolds. No complaint. No radio traffic that would explain why Hart initiated contact. Then they compared Hart's on-camera conduct to policy. The problem was not subtle. Hart issued commands and escalated to detention language without articulating a lawful basis. He did not document the stop. He did not cite a statute. He did not show reasonable suspicion on record. That alone was enough for sustained findings. But Internal Affairs kept going because the park footage raised a bigger question. If he did this when there were witnesses and cameras everywhere, what did he do when there were fewer eyes? They pulled more footage and more incidents. Same structure, different locations. Hart approached people in public spaces, made immediate demands, asked personal questions, and used pressure to force compliance. When people pushed back by asking for legal justification, he shifted tactics. When recording was visible, he ended the encounter quickly. Again and again, the stops ended without reports, without citations, without arrests. That pattern mattered because it exposed intent without anyone needing to read his mind. A lawful stop can be explained and documented. A stop built on control usually cannot. Internal Affairs reopened prior complaints. Some were from people who had never been arrested, never cited, and never even told what they supposedly did wrong. The old closures started to look different when the investigators had a documented example of Hart initiating detentions without cause and leaving no paperwork. They also reviewed supervision. Hart's volume of public contacts was high compared to peers, while his documentation was low. That is an obvious mismatch. The department could not claim it had no warning signs. It had data, but it wasn't using it the way it should have. The misconduct findings went up the chain. Hart was interviewed. He tried to justify the stop as checking suspicious behavior, but he could not point to any behavior that met the standard. He referenced general park concerns, but there was no call. He implied safety reasons, but he never articulated them during the encounter. The cameras showed a stop that started as a command and ended as a retreat the moment Reynolds identified federal authority. When that interview was compared against video and logs, the credibility gap widened. Hart was terminated. He appealed, and the appeal failed. The department's decision held because it was built on the cleanest kind of proof: what he did, what he said, and what he did not document. His certification was flagged. That meant the career impact went beyond one department. He was no longer just a local officer who could quietly transfer to another badge and repeat the same pattern. Then came the part departments usually avoid talking about: what they did wrong. They acknowledged policy failures in supervision and oversight, not as a public performance, but as a necessary admission inside the system that allowed a pattern to grow. Reforms were implemented with specific controls designed to prevent exactly this kind of stop from staying invisible. They increased body camera audits with targeted review for officers who initiated a high number of stops without corresponding reports. They required on-camera articulation of reasonable suspicion for detentions, not after the fact, not in a supervisor's office, but in the moment when it actually mattered. They expanded supervisory review for repeat stop and release behavior and created earlier intervention steps. When patterns appeared, they reinforced training on constitutional standards with scenario-based evaluations that focused on documentation, lawful basis, and de-escalation, not just officer presence. Harborview Park did not become a viral headline. There was no national debate cycle, no trending clip, no influencer commentary. The outcome was quieter and, in some ways, more serious. The system corrected itself because it had no room to deny what the record showed. Reynolds completed his FBI assignment without compromise. He did not need to win in public to get justice. He needed the documentation to reach the right place. And it did. The final lesson from this case was simple. When authority cannot state its legal basis, it collapses the moment oversight shows up. Not because someone got loud, but because the facts left nowhere to hide. So here's the question for you. If you were sitting on that bench and an officer demanded your ID with no reason, would you know what to ask, and would you stay calm enough to keep the record clean? If you've experienced something like this or witnessed it, share what happened in the comments. And if you want more stories where dignity, documentation, and accountability win without theatrics, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next one.
Stay right there. Don't move.
Why you stop me?
I'm checking the vehicle.
I provided my documents. I do not consent to any search of my vehicle.
If there's nothing to hide, this is quick.
You're searching without consent and without explaining why. I want a supervisor.
An 8-year patrol officer decided a black man in a luxury BMW had to be doing something wrong, and he tried to turn a nothing stop into a big arrest through pure intimidation. What he didn't know was that the calm driver he was trying to corner wasn't just any citizen. He was a sitting federal judge who understood exactly how unlawful stops fall apart, and he was already building a record that would cost people their jobs, their careers, and their excuses. At this moment, I want to tell you that we're incredibly grateful you chose to spend your time with us today. Your support keeps this channel alive and thriving. Before we rewind, tell us where you're watching from, your country or your state, in the comments. And if you like stories where bias meets accountability and the truth is caught on camera, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now, here's what was happening when things got tense. Officer Daniel Reese had his patrol car angled behind a black BMW on the shoulder, under streetlights near a busy shopping corridor. His body camera was running, his dash camera was running. Passing traffic was steady. There were storefronts nearby with security cameras pointed toward the road. Reese was already past professional stop mode. He had ordered the driver out quickly before offering a clear reason. He positioned himself like the stop was dangerous, even though there had been no speeding, no swerving, no broken light, no plate issue, and no alert tied to the vehicle. His posture and tone were built for control, not clarity. The driver, Judge Michael Harrington, didn't match Reese's energy. Harrington moved slowly, kept his hands visible, and did exactly what a careful person did when a situation felt wrong. He complied physically while demanding a legal basis verbally. He handed over his license and registration when asked. He repeated the same question in different ways, calm every time, making sure the cameras captured it. Reese refused to give a clean answer. He avoided anything that sounded like a real traffic reason because there wasn't one. Instead, he dragged the moment out, asking extra questions, taking long pauses, and trying to make Harrington fill the silence. That's a common tactic. If the officer can't justify the stop, the next move is to fish for something else. Harrington didn't give him anything. No arguing, no sudden movements, no insulting language, no emotional outburst Reese could later describe as aggressive. Harrington kept his voice level and his words specific. He made it clear he did not consent to any searches. He requested a supervisor. He repeated that he wanted the lawful reason stated on the record. That's when Reese started pushing harder. He claimed he needed to confirm the vehicle wasn't stolen, but he didn't cite a report. He didn't cite a matching description. He didn't cite a dispatch hit. He didn't cite a tag return that raised suspicion. He just acted like the car itself was suspicious because of who was driving it. Harrington's calm didn't soften Reese. It irritated him, because calm doesn't feel like submission. Calm feels like resistance when someone is trying to dominate the moment. Reese circled the BMW as if he was hunting for an excuse he could point to later. He shined his light into the cabin. He stared at the VIN area. He looked for anything that could be framed as probable cause. He didn't find it. So he tried the next step: pressure. He implied that cooperation would make this go faster. He hinted at consequences without naming them. He made it sound like Harrington had something to hide simply because he was asserting rights. That's the move. Turn basic legal boundaries into suspicion. But Harrington didn't shift. He continued doing the one thing that makes bad stops dangerous for the officer involved. He kept the interaction clean. He gave Reese no behavior problem to use as cover. He kept returning to the same point. The reason for the stop had to exist before the stop, not be invented afterward. And here's the part people miss when they watch these clips online. This wasn't just an argument on the roadside. This was a power contest over the narrative. Reese wanted the stop to become a story that justified itself. Harrington wanted the stop to stay exactly what it was: a decision made first and rationalized later. The cameras were the referee. Reese held Harrington's ID longer than necessary, studying it like he was hoping it would magically become fake if he stared at it long enough. Harrington didn't flinch. He kept his hands visible. He stayed measured. He kept requesting the supervisor. He kept stating non-consent to search. Reese returned to the vehicle. The Bodycam audio caught the shift in his breathing and pacing. He was reaching the point where his assumption had produced nothing, and he still needed an outcome that let him feel like he won the stop. This is where the stop stopped being routine and started becoming a case. Because once an officer makes a stop with no lawful basis, every minute after that becomes risk. If they let the person go, they feel embarrassed. If they keep going, they dig deeper. And if they cross a line on camera, the footage doesn't care about their pride. Reese went back toward the BMW, and he moved like he'd made a decision. And Harrington, without raising his voice, kept doing the same thing that was driving Reese crazy. He stayed composed, stayed factual, and kept the record clear. Reese made the move that officers only make when they don't have a real reason to hold someone and they still want control. He told Harrington he was going to search the BMW anyway, as if saying it confidently would turn it into lawful authority. Harrington didn't step into the trap. He didn't get loud. He didn't reach. He didn't argue about the search itself in a way that would look like resistance. He did the smart thing. He stated clearly and repeatedly that he did not consent, and he asked again for the legal basis to be stated on camera. Reese refused to give one. He kept it vague on purpose. He leaned on general phrases, the kind that sound official but don't actually explain anything. He acted like the stop was about confirming ownership, yet he hadn't started with any legitimate traffic reason, hadn't gotten a hit from dispatch, and hadn't pointed to any specific indicator that the car was stolen. Then he went hands-on with the vehicle. He opened the door and started looking through the cabin. Not a quick glance, not a focused safety check. It was a search in the plain meaning of the word, moving items, checking compartments, looking under seats. He did it slowly, like He was hoping something would appear if he took long enough. Harrington stood near the shoulder with his hands visible, watching without moving closer. He kept his posture neutral. He kept requesting a supervisor. He kept asking for the reason. And he made sure his words were measured, the kind of tone that plays well later when someone watches the footage without context. Reese tried pressure again. He suggested that if Harrington just cooperated, he'd be on his way. He implied Harrington was prolonging this by asserting rights. He framed it like a favor being offered. Harrington didn't accept the framing. He stayed on one track. Consent was denied, and the officer needed lawful cause, not attitude. Reese walked back to his cruiser and called for backup. That detail mattered because it showed what he was building. Numbers. When a stop is weak, officers sometimes stack the scene with uniforms and hope the visual makes the citizen fold. A second unit arrived within minutes. The second officer didn't take over. He took a position. He watched Harrington more than he watched Reese. That was the silent message. The driver was the problem, not the lack of a reason. Reese went back to the BMW and expanded the search. He popped the trunk. He moved through bags and personal items with the kind of casual disregard that doesn't look like investigation and does look like punishment. He checked places where nothing about a stolen car concern would logically require him to look. And still, nothing. No tools, no altered VIN plate, no mismatched registration, no contraband, no evidence that matched the assumption that started this. At this stage, the power game got obvious. Reese didn't have a stop. He had a story he wanted to be true, and every minute that passed without evidence made his position weaker, not stronger. On camera, it didn't look like policing. It looked like fishing. Harrington stayed steady. He didn't mock him. He didn't say the words that would turn the moment into a shouting match. He simply kept asking for what every lawful stop requires, an articulated reason. Reese's responses got shorter and sharper. He started acting like Harrington's calm was disrespect. That's a common flip. When intimidation fails, the next tactic is to label composure as defiance. A few cars slowed as they passed. A bystander across the street raised a phone and pointed it towards the shoulder. Storefront cameras covered the area. Reese didn't seem to care or didn't realize how much coverage he was standing in. Either way, the record was growing. Reese then did another thing that mattered. He held on to Harrington's license again, longer than necessary, like he was searching for an excuse inside the plastic. He told the second officer to run checks again. The returns came back clean. That should have been the end. Clean checks, no evidence, no legitimate reason for the stop in the first place. A professional officer de-escalates, documents, and clears the scene. Reese didn't. Instead, he tried to manufacture a reason after the fact. He switched from stolen vehicle to identity issue because he needed something to justify the time, the search, and the posture he had taken from the first second. He began suggesting the identification didn't look right. He started talking about impersonation in a way that made it sound like he had discovered something serious, even though he hadn't discovered anything new at all. Harrington responded the same way he had all night, calm, precise, and focused on the legal basis. He did not consent to further search. He requested the supervisor again. He stated that the stop had no lawful foundation. That's when Sergeant Lana Ortiz arrived. Ortiz walked in and took one look at the scene. 2 patrol cars, a luxury BMW, a calm driver standing off to the side, and Reese acting like he was in the middle of a major arrest. She asked Reese what the original basis was. Reese gave her something vague. He leaned on suspicion without specifics. He tried to sell it like instinct and experience. He also tried to frame Harrington as difficult, because that's the easy way to justify escalation. Ortiz then spoke with Harrington briefly. She heard the same clear points. No traffic violation, no consent to search, repeated requests for the legal basis, and compliance without aggression. She didn't get theatrics. She got a record, and now Ortiz had a choice. Supervisors either correct the officer in the moment or protect the officer and hope nobody ever sees the footage. Ortiz didn't immediately shut it down, but she also didn't fully endorse Reese's behavior. She asked what evidence Reese had that the ID was fraudulent. Reese didn't have evidence. He had irritation and a need to be right. The search was already done. It had already produced nothing. The checks had already come back clean. The cameras had already captured the timeline. Reese was running out of room. So he did what some people do when they realize they can't win on facts. He tried to win by force of accusation. He turned the stop into a claim that Harrington was lying about who he was. And that was the moment the entire encounter shifted from unlawful to catastrophic. Because now Reese wasn't just overstepping. He was setting up a charge that could only exist if someone ignored the obvious truth. Reese committed to the news story because the old one had failed. He told Sergeant Ortiz that Harrington's identification looked suspicious and that Harrington was claiming a status he couldn't verify. He framed it like a public safety issue instead of admitting the stop had started with nothing. He pointed at the BMW, then at the paperwork, trying to make the scene itself look like proof. Harrington stayed controlled. He explained who he was without raising his voice. He repeated that he had complied, that there had been no traffic violation, and that Reese had searched without consent. He asked Ortiz to stop the detention unless Reese could state a lawful basis on camera. Ortiz asked Reese for something concrete to justify the arrest threat. Reese didn't produce evidence. He produced certainty. He acted like confidence could replace probable cause. Then he did the thing that ends careers. He escalated to handcuffs to force the situation to look serious. Reese ordered Harrington to turn around and place him in custody for what he described as fraudulent identification and impersonation. It was a charge built on nothing but the officer's refusal to accept the truth in front of him. The second officer stood by and didn't intervene. Ortiz didn't physically stop it. She let it happen, and that decision became part of the later fallout. Harrington didn't resist. He didn't argue in a way that would muddy the video. He stated calmly that the arrest was unlawful and that the cameras would show it. He also requested that the supervisors preserve the recordings and dispatch logs. That was the chess move. Harrington wasn't trying to win roadside. He was locking the record so nobody could rewrite it later. At the station, the tone changed fast. A desk supervisor took the paperwork, looked at the name, and paused. Another staff member checked internal directories. Within minutes, phone calls started moving up the chain. The normal booking rhythm broke. Reese tried to keep acting like it was routine, but the station didn't treat it like routine. Someone asked Reese for the original basis of the stop. He gave the same vague language he'd used on the shoulder. The problem was that vague doesn't survive video. And now everyone knew there was video. Harrington was held briefly while identities were verified through official channels. Once confirmation came back, the department faced a choice: double down on the arrest or unwind it immediately before the paperwork became permanent. They unwound it. Harrington was released without the officer's story ever being supported by an actual violation, an alert, or evidence from the search. But the damage was already done, and Harrington didn't leave quietly in the legal sense. He left with names, times, badge numbers, and a clear understanding of what the footage would show when requested. Within days, formal preservation letters went out. Bodycam, dashcam, dispatch audio, CAD logs, and nearby business footage were requested before anything could be lost. A civil rights attorney got involved early, not to posture, but to control the timeline and the evidence. Then the recording spoke. The footage showed no traffic violation. It showed Reese ordering Harrington out without a clear reason. It captured Harrington's repeated non-consent to search. It captured a search that produced nothing. And it captured the pivot into identity claims only after the officer came up empty. That is the part departments can't spin, because it isn't opinion, it's sequence. The story spread beyond the city once people realized who the driver was and what the cameras captured. The department tried to contain it internally at first, but the moment it reached outside oversight, containment stopped being an option. The department tried to treat it like an embarrassing mistake that could be handled quietly. They failed, because this wasn't the kind of incident that stayed local once the record was preserved. Harrington didn't do media first. He did paperwork first. Within days, his legal team filed preservation demands and formal requests tied to the stop. Bodycam, dashcam, dispatch audio, CAD logs, supervisor notes, and any internal messages about the incident. That mattered because departments sometimes summarize incidents before the raw footage gets reviewed. Harrington's team cut that off early by locking the evidence trail. Then the civil rights lawsuit landed. It wasn't written like a speech. It was written like a map. It laid out the timeline. No traffic violation, no articulable suspicion, an extended detention without lawful basis, a non-consensual search, then a fabricated pivot into identity accusations after the search came up empty. The claim wasn't just that Reese was rude. The claim was that Reese violated constitutional standards and then tried to cover the failure with criminal allegations. Once that filing hit, federal attention followed fast because the facts were clean and the footage was clear. The city's first move was predictable. They placed Reese on administrative leave, announced an internal review, and emphasized that the department took the matter seriously. That language is designed to buy time. Time didn't help them because the investigation didn't stay inside the building. A parallel federal inquiry opened, and that is where the stop stopped being about one officer. Investigators asked for complaint histories, prior stop data, and patterns tied to vehicle searches and suspicious ID claims. They looked for how often Reese initiated stops without clear traffic reasons, how often he searched, and how often supervisors signed off afterward. That's where the real problem surfaced. There were prior complaints. People had reported being stopped without clear reasons, being questioned like they were suspects first and drivers second, and being searched after refusing consent. Some complaints had been dismissed as misunderstandings. Some had been marked not sustained due to insufficient evidence. Now the evidence existed and it matched the complaints. Supervisory complicity became the next issue. Sergeant Ortiz wasn't the only one who had been on scenes like that. Command staff had seen patterns in numbers, or at minimum they had been responsible for not looking at them. The department's oversight structure showed a familiar failure. Complaints were treated like PR problems, not early warning signals. With the footage public and the lawsuit active, the city's risk calculation flipped. The question wasn't, can we defend this? It was, how much worse does this get if we try? Reese was terminated. His badge and authority were gone. But that wasn't the end because termination is employment. The investigations were criminal and civil rights related. An indictment followed. The charging theory wasn't complicated. It focused on the unlawful detention, the unlawful search, and the false statements used to justify escalation. The case didn't rely on opinions about bias. It relied on sequence, policy, and what the officer said and did on recording compared to what he later claimed. Reese's defense tried to frame it as good faith policing, but the gap between the footage and the paperwork was too big. A jury doesn't need to be a constitutional scholar to understand when a reason is invented after the fact. The city, meanwhile, faced the civil case math. Settlement talks were not just about Harrington. They were about precedent. The moment a city admits a stop was pretextual and discriminatory on a clean record. It triggers copycat filings and reopens old ones. The city tried to limit exposure, but the federal inquiry was already digging into patterns, and that forced broader concessions. A major settlement was reached. The number was large enough that it couldn't be explained as nuisance. It was damages, legal fees, and the cost of failing to supervise. The payout hit the budget, but the bigger cost was structural. The department was placed under a federal consent decree. That meant external oversight with mandatory reforms, not optional training memos. The consent decree required tighter stop documentation, stricter supervisory review of searches, better Bodycam compliance audits, early warning systems for repeat complaints, and data monitoring tied to race and outcomes. It also forced a change in how complaints were classified and investigated because not sustained stopped being a convenient trash bin when the department could be audited. Then the past came back. Dozens of cases connected to Reese, and a small circle of officers were flagged for review, especially arrests where the initial stop reason was unclear, or where searches were justified with vague language. Defense attorneys started filing motions. Prosecutors started reviewing whether evidence had been obtained lawfully. Some convictions were challenged. Some charges were dropped. Some plea deals were questioned. Even when cases didn't overturn, the department's credibility took damage in courtrooms. Inside the department, people reacted in two ways. Some officers were angry that Reese made them look bad. Others were angry that supervisors had let it go on long enough to blow up the whole department. Quietly, plenty of officers understood the real lesson. The problem wasn't just that Reese made a biased assumption. The problem was that he felt protected enough to escalate search and fabricate on camera. Harrington didn't treat it like a personal victory lap. He treated it like a rule of law correction. He didn't claim the system was perfect now. He didn't pretend one consent decree fixed decades. But he made sure one thing was clear. When documentation exists and a person refuses to be bullied into silence, the usual escape routes close fast. And here's what I want to ask you. If you were in that position, would you have stayed as calm as Harrington did, knowing the goal was to bait you into a reaction? Or would you have argued in a way that gave the officer something to use later? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you've ever experienced a stop that felt pretextual, share what happened, as much as you're comfortable sharing. And if you want more stories where accountability wins and the record speaks louder than excuses, like the video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one.